this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Now we are at our third segment of the ASEAN Breakfast Call, which is the dialogue. And today we have Yasmin Masidi. She's a representative of Empower. Welcome to our studio in Durian ASEAN.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So today, me and Gauri will be interviewing you on the topic, which is it was quite hot early this year or late last year, which is early this month and late last month, which is on the Teluk Intan by-election. And today's topic we will talk about after Teluk Intan, what's next for Malaysian women.
Right.
Yeah, and Amaria Chin Abdullah will be joining us on the second half of this segment. Before that, I just want to know, what does Empower do?
Well, Empower stands for Persatuan Kesedaran Komuniti Selangor. We are an organization that works on women's political participation. We train women from the grassroots, be it from a community or from political parties, to put themselves forward as candidates for elections or for local councils. And we also follow them throughout their journey. So it's not just a few trainings or one-off training, but it also includes mentorship as well. We believe really that greater women's political participation is a pathway towards greater equality for women.
Mm-hmm. And you've been observing a lot on the Teluk Intan by-election, because he has been quite it's a turning point of event when it comes to women political participation. But would you agree with that?
Well, in a way, it is. I think that it shows that the AP at least is willing to take more risk in terms of its women candidates. Out of the, I think it was 9 women MPs from the opposition parties in the last G13 who were elected to parliament. The AP supplied about 45% of them.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's almost
so
half,
in political parties, I guess in the report book, DAP would be getting an A for women's political participation.
B plus,
B plus.
perhaps. There are some great things about DAP. You can't fault the machinery in terms of the support that they give to women who are contesting. On the other hand, there are not so good things about DAP's internal machinery when it comes to women's political participation. There are question marks, for example, over the way with which DAP campaigns for its women, how it frames women candidates. For example, in G13 and previous elections, there has been this tendency, for example, to refer to younger women candidates as flowers, which I don't think is a step forward really in terms of women's political participation.
And both political camps are at fault when it comes to the way it refers to younger women's participation in politics.
Certainly. I mean, I still can't forget, for example, the leaflets that were going around when Theoni Ching contested, implying that she is unfit to be a people's representative because she has to take care of a child.
Mm-hmm. Before we analyze critically on the Teluk Intan by-election, let's move out away and look at a big picture in terms of women participation on the in the long run. Has women been actively participated in politics since independence, or women were always being the marginalized group? Because I know in the past there were a lot of women's movement, especially during the time of the communist era, but I'm not sure what is the development for now.
I think women have always been part and parcel of political movements in this country, even before independence. Of course, they don't get to be, the ones in the photographs, with, all of the politicians and the leaders. But they're the ones always in the background doing all this really important work to make sure that things, run smoothly. And certainly, I think the mobilization of women among the grassroots of Malaysia, as well as among the elite level, certainly led to the dominance of UMNO in Malaysia's political sphere. That cannot be denied. And you can still see, I guess, a historical connection to that in the way with which UMNO provides most of the women from Barisan Nasional who are elected state assembly persons in the country. I think all except one of women state assembly persons in Malaysia are from UMNO.
Only one.
Well, all except one. the lone women state assembly persons who was not from UMNO was from a Sarawakian party, I believe.
So, why women has not been like actively involved, like as in being elected into politics as much as we hope it would be?
Well, the factors are complicated. Of course, a lot of it has to do with the position of women in society. While I still think there is a great deal of respect, or at least the outward forms of respect given to the roles of women as mothers, as really the person who holds, a community or a family together, that doesn't really translate to women's participation in public life or room being made for women's participation in public life. Because at the end of the day, their dominant role, or rather their most important role, is still seen as, being located, in the home. There is also, I think, a devaluation of women's work. So while women form the backbone of, like door to door or like canvassing during election time, doing administrative work, really like a lot of like the organizational work, that's not seen as important. And, at the party level, there is this resistance, towards women becoming leaders. It's as if, all right, fine, we want, your work in the party. But it's there is this resistance to women becoming leaders, and part of that, is this perception that men, for example, always have to be the one, of a greater social status than women.
So women in Malaysia, are they systematically being discriminated, or are they being discriminated because they themselves don't believe in themselves? I mean, although this question is a bit irony, but I'm just curious, because there's a lot of women's wing political party, but there's no like a political party that is for all. So when it comes to like the Barisan Nasional, but when it comes to the opposition, maybe they have a different approach. And you say that the DAP has been much progressive in terms of having women in political party participation. But what about other political parties within the opposition as well as Barisan? Have they progressed as well, or they have moved backwards?
Well, we do see a trend in a slight increase of women's political participation really as a whole, just not really enough of it. More women were, ran for seats, like in the last parliament, but there's only a slight increase in terms of women who were put forward by political parties. There were 7, independent candidates who were women who ran for parliamentary elections in G13. So that's like 7 out of 56 candidates. That's quite a lot. So it does say something about, political parties. I think in terms of like the way that they've tried to move forward with women's political participation, I think political parties do see the importance of having more women leaders. However, there is a disagreement on how to best about, to do that. PKR does have a commitment towards 30% women's political participation. DAP actually rejects, any notion of a quota. Yes.
Is there a reason behind it? Are they against quota in general, or they're just against, the idea of, providing a platform for women in general? For DAP. Yeah. Oh, yeah. By the way, Maria Chin just joined in with us, and she's going to give comment for this question.
Yeah. Morning. I guess that for DAP and all the other political parties, there is stated in their manifesto the 30%, but when it actually comes to implementation, that is where they actually falters quite a lot. Because if you look at the number of candidates that they put up, while it may have been on an increase, but the number of candidates who actually win the election, we are still back to, the 10% and 6 to 8% at the state level.
But what about other political parties like PAS, PKR, and also, parties within the Barisan Nasional coalitions?
Well, actually, UMNO and MCA and all that, I have not actually seen their manifesto, but neither have they done very well in putting forward women's candidates. For the last election, I think the party that does quite well is actually DAP, PKR, and also PAS, surprisingly.
Surprising. And why do you think so? I mean, is it something that is systematically, like I said earlier, like, you know, you just move all the women within the women's wing and that's it? Or is it because within the women themselves, they don't have the confidence within themselves? Or is it because of other factors?
That's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, because there is such a thing as, internalized misogyny. And I think it's also important to consider that, when talking about, well, how do you increase, participation, what's wrong with the women, which is a question that some people from some political parties have actually asked, in terms of trying to find enough women candidates to run. But there was we held actually a session with Dr. Bridget Welsh on trends in women's political participation.
She's an academician.
Yeah, just before G13, and she noted that the uptick in political violence and dirty campaigning actually deterred women from putting themselves forward, as candidates. And I think that's also important, because where there is political violence, women feel much more anxiety about it, than men. Certainly because of the forms of gendered violence that, women already face, like at home. And they see that there is a possibility of them being in a greater vulnerable position. Certainly when you look at the kind of like dirty tactics or dirty political campaigning that are used against women, it is very different from, the way that you have smear tactics being done against like men. Sure, there is, of course, the infamous Anwar sodomy case, and that is an example of
smear tactics
that takes the form of something sexualized. But women face that, much, much more. And it's also often related to their biological functions or biological sex as well, which men rarely, if ever, face.
Mm-hmm. And let's move to the Teluk Intan by-election. It's a very interesting election because you have someone young and a female, Diana Sophia, and someone old and who is been part of this political game for quite some time, which is Datuk Mas Yew Kong. From your observation of this by-election, what do you see there's a changes in terms of Teluk Intan's voting pattern and the outcomes? Or do you think that Malaysian in general have are not in terms of receiving enough in terms of the idea of having a young woman, be in the parliament?
I was just looking up some figures on the voting patterns in Teluk Intan. And from the figures released by On Keong Min from DAP, he said that there was a drop of 15% support from the Chinese community, a drop of 10% support from the Indian community, but there is a slight increase of 3% from the Malay community in Teluk Intan, which is unfortunately not enough to overcome the drop in support and the low turnout of voters, like in general during the Teluk Intan by-election, which is only less than 70%, about 67, 66. There are a lot of factors, at play here. I think, though, that what we are lacking is actually an intersectional analysis, looking at not just race or not just gender and not just political campaigning, but something that actually connects, all of this together. Certainly, I think that the way with which Diana was initially framed as a candidate by DAP was a turn-off, for some people. But
which part of herself the way she was being framed, that was a turn-off by the general public in Teluk Intan?
Well, I think that there has been enough research, done by now to say, for example, in sports science, which, although not related to politics, there is some things that can draw in that while selling women as attractive and sexualized may sell magazines, it doesn't actually induce people to participate or more women to participate in that particular sport, for example, or that particular field. In terms of Diana Sofia, she was presented as someone really young, and DAP's and Pakatan's campaigning really did make use of her looks. That's undeniable. The way which was the initial posters were framed and distributed, and how even Pakatan leaders how they speak about her during rallies and such, that doesn't really give a good impression the voters. While on the other hand they were speaking to media decrying BN's sexism, which was true, and they were right to fight against such of sexism. But on the other hand, your own people or your own supporters, are doing this. So there is this, not quite hypocrisy, but there is this untenable, tension there, which I think confuses, voters as well. And people are not stupid. They're going to look at that and see what is going on.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add on?
I guess I agree with that. I think what happened in Teluk Intan, I hope it will be a good lesson for DAP, because I think that DAP has always been selling beauty. Because probably they think that,
you mean when it comes to women candidates, yes, they have always been portraying the beauty side of the woman rather than her brain, is it?
Yeah, and in terms of even their selection, if you look at the range of women that they actually select, and they actually underestimate the awareness of the voters, because voters go beyond beauty. And like what Yasmin says, beauty may sell a sports magazine, but in politics, it has to be more than just your beauty. And I think that increasingly, voters are asking for quality. What is your agenda for the nation? And that has to be very clear. Very clear as to how you're going to deal with the economic side, the social side, and the cultural side.
Were there any agenda put forth by both candidates in terms of what kind of changes they're going to make for Teluk Intan or Malaysia as a whole?
I think Ma, had a more concrete, manifesto in terms of his political promises. He actually lays out exactly what it is that he's going to do in Teluk Intan, and I think that's quite attractive, to voters. Diana Sofia's manifesto was more, how do I put this? There's a lot of ideas, in there. There's a lot of idealism, which is also attractive. But how does that translate to voters, on the ground? In terms of, Pakatan's promises, sure, they always point to Selangor, to Penang as examples of how, yes, we can administer a state or a constituency. But I think they need to do a lot more convincing in terms of, all right, so how are you actually going to roll out, these plans? What are the steps that you're going to take, into account, and what are you going to put into place, to bring forth, all your plans? There is a level of concreteness that is missing from the DAP campaigning when it comes to bread and butter issue. Unfortunately, of course, any BN candidate, in the Teluk Intan by-election is always going to have the backing the federal government and all the resources that BN can bring forth. They can pour a lot of money into it, which, of course, the opposition can't, possibly fight against when it comes to goodies. But I still feel that there is a way with which DAP can substantively campaign on issues that appeal more to the ground. I do appreciate DAP's campaigning to try and get Malaysia out of this really racialized thinking and racial boxes. But is that enough to win elections yet? Have they done enough to prepare the ground, to make them more receptive?
The bread and butter issues, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We will continue again. In a short while, we will take a break now, and we will discuss more about the Teluk Intan by-election and women's participation in politics.
The voice of sharing, Durian ASEAN.
Hey, we are are back from a short break, and now I'm still with Maria Chin as well as Yasmin Masidi from Empower, discussing about after Teluk Intan, what's next for Malaysian women in politics. So about Teluk Intan by-election, off air just now we discussed about the Teluk Intan by-election, how what is the internal politics within this political party, and I'm just wondering, like with the case of Diana Sofia, is she like an exception? Like how was she being elected? How was she being chosen as one of the candidate for the Teluk Intan by-election?
I guess that for DAP, I don't know how internally they select their candidates, but for me, I feel that it was a good selection in the sense that she's young and a woman, and she has that energy. Yeah, she actually gives off the energy to want to give more to the people of Teluk Intan, and I guess that selection gels quite well. But subsequently, in terms of the messaging, what she presents herself, I think there are some weaknesses in that.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think that at a whole she was actually at a disadvantage point instead of an advantage form for being a woman and a female? A female and also a Malay in this general election. In this by-election.
Well, one disadvantage that she did face is that she's not from Teluk Intan.
Oh, okay.
I think we really have to face up to the fact that...
and Datuk Umar was?
Yes, he was. And he was the party president of Gerakan as well, which is one advantage. I think that in terms of Diana Sofia's position as someone who can be dismissed as an outsider, that actually is a very potent messaging, on the part of BN. And that's actually a pattern that we've been seeing in terms of women running for seats as well. They do tend to be more often, positioned as parachute candidates, put into seats where far away from where they may have been working on the ground. We have, for example, in the last G13, a trainee who had been working in one constituency, and she was supposed to run for the seat in that constituency, but at the last minute she was moved to another constituency simply because of the internal horse trading within the political parties and within the coalition meant that she lost out.
Is it a common thing within political parties to do this horse trading for seats and women being the victims for it?
Yes, horse trading is fairly common. That happens all over the world. But in Malaysia, unfortunately, you have all of these factors, not just race, not just religion, but also gender becoming a factor in who loses out and who wins. Women tend to have not as much bargaining power as men, especially when party leaderships, in general, are still very much dominated by men. PAS actually did bring up an interesting point, after the Teluk Intan by-election, where they responded to a criticism by DAP on the hooded issues and accused DAP's factionalism of being a factor in Diana Sofia's loss. Unfortunately, there are no other reports in the media, and I think it's a pity that you have all of these hints coming out in the media from statements, and there's no follow-up by the media saying we really need more substantive analysis of not just the Teluk Intan by-elections, but really
in general, in the political party itself.
The machinery, the internal workings. I think that's a necessity for us to really shine the spotlight on political parties and hold them accountable for what they do internally as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like what I have earlier said, I think that the voters nowadays do demand much more from their candidates, and they would like to see a clear agenda. But one thing is, I'm quite impressed by Diana Sofia, is that she's one of those candidates who actually talks about gender equality when she actually presents her manifesto. And it's very rare
Even within women politicians themselves.
Women and male politicians have not actually really talked about gender equality. Although she wasn't very concrete about what she wants to deliver, but the very fact that she raised that issue means that means something. That she has actually seen and weighed out, what are the key issues that concerns voters. But the other thing is that when you actually look at the playing field, definitely it is always unbalanced. There's a lot of resources that BN has, and Ma's agenda it sounds like another BN kind of agenda where, if you vote me, I'll give you development, I'll give you the resources, the funds and all that, and even throw in that, I'm offered a member of parliament or minister position. And it also relates to the way in which our country actually actually design its electoral system, because we are first past the post. First past the post means that, winner takes all. So regardless of whether you actually win popular vote, which is what happened in GE13, as long as you win the seats, you actually form the government. First past the post also poses a lot of issues, especially for candidates who don't have that much of resources, because nowadays general elections require a lot of money, hard cash, because the competition is much higher, and women don't have that kind of resources. Diana is actually very lucky that the whole party actually throws their resources behind
the whole coalition
her.
as well,
Yes,
not just the
whole
party.
And she has that support. Yeah, but this is a by-election. In the general election, the political parties' resources kind of like even out, because each have to actually take care of their own, and that is where the resources actually counts, particularly where the opposition is concerned, because they do not have the whole machinery behind them. They don't have enough money to campaign, and there's a lot more challenges. And for women, and also for even smaller political parties, that is the biggest challenge, finding resources and being able to actually compete. Thinking that you're competing on a level playing field, it will never be a level playing field. In some countries, they actually allocate money for people who actually political parties allocate money for their candidates and all that. But in Malaysia, the opposition may not even have enough resources to do that.
And I'm quite interested in Ong Kian Ming's analysis, even though it's a race-based analysis. I'm just quite curious why the Chinese and the Indian were the factor of Diana Sofia not winning the seats. Is it? I mean, for question one, are the Teluk Intan's people still caught up in the race-based voting pattern? And number two is it has to do with Diana Sofia's gender as well?
I'm not sure. Maybe Yasmin can comment on Kian Ming's analysis, but I'm not sure whether Diana's race actually is a factor. I feel that it is the way she has actually been messaging, and I think that one is her comment about hudud. By declaring that she would vote out hudud, what does that mean? That is not well actually explained, and it would have been much better if she had explained it properly rather than throw it out as just a campaign message. I don't think people can accept that anymore, and hudud is so close to everybody's heart. And if you throw it out and you don't explain, I think that is not very...
and I don't know if her mom's association with Perkasa has anything to do with, the Chinese and Indian being turned off by Diana Sofia as well.
Well, possibly. I mean, in the absence of a comprehensive survey to look, asking voters in Teluk Intan, why did you vote the way that you did? We can only draw conclusions from, figures and from what we've seen in the press. Certainly, like the 15%, swing of Chinese support, towards Ma, that says something. But what does that actually say? Does that have to do with race, or does that have to do with the goodies or the election promises that were in, like Mas manifesto? I personally feel that race does play a factor, but I think it plays out in a much more complicated way than that is usually
just about
expressed.
Chinese, Malay, and Indian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, for example, dismiss like the sense of disenfranchisement, especially among semi-rural or semi-urban, Malaysians of Chinese and Indian descent. But that there's also an economic factor, in there, as you see. And certainly, like the way that Diana's gender has been framed, and the connections to perhaps her perkasa, her UMNO, like background, the continuing unease with PAS, pushing forward on hudud, the whole mess that's going on with, the PKR party elections, that can't have helped.
Another thing is about her being a young woman. I don't know what are the challenges and how far a young woman can actually go in terms of participation in Malaysian politics, because a lot of young women, especially in the case of Diana Sofia, they were almost always being the target of how they look, their history, their their sexual lives and all that. So what are the challenges of young women, and why young women are always being the target of all these kind of slurs?
I don't think it's a young woman's problem. If you look at Teresa Kok, she up till today, after being in MP for so many terms, she is still being criticized, and sexist remarks are being made to her. I think that it is generally how people look at women candidates and women elected representatives.
And what is the way the society look at women in Malaysia?
I think that they just feel that, women are sex objects, okay? And so therefore you have, Bung Mokhtar, the very famous MPs, with all his sexist comments, and he can get away with it.
Yeah, they are not being held accountable.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the parliament has to be held responsible, because in their standing order there is no mention that disciplinary actions will be taken against people who actually spew out sexist remarks. We have actually, the women's group has actually been asking for an amendment to the standing order. But up to today, the speaker is not interested to actually amend the standing order to take to task people who actually talks in sexist languages.
So the law is not supportive of women when it comes to like sexist remark or any sexual
The standing order.
In the standing order.
Within the parliament. In our laws, we don't have Sexual Harassment Act, and we don't have an Equality Act, to actually tease out all these discrimination against
in employment
women.
and all that. Yeah. Other than that, what kind of discrimination that women face in politics, and especially young women?
I think that the women in politics face one is when you actually get elected, you are actually entering a very set atmosphere within the parliament or even within the state level, where it is an atmosphere where the men have actually feel that this is their area, this is their arena, and you are entering into their arena because for a long time, women's political participation has been very low. But now we are seeing more women entering into the political field. And that is where the power sharing has to start. But the power sharing is always very difficult, right? And so therefore, the women, I think that instead of challenging that power structure, actually tries to fit into that power structure. You take one of the example was YB Nancy Shukri, when the women's group actually wanted to see her because she's the head of the gender caucus to discuss about the criminal procedure code in relation to sexual violence. And she couldn't make a decision to actually see the women's groups until she has approval from the Human Rights Commission. That one at that time it was YB Nasri. So that is what I mean by you actually don't actually challenge that the power structure, but actually you try to please that power structure. And it's about time that elected women representatives start thinking differently, and even the male politicians have to think differently, because now the playing field, there are more women coming into that playing field, and they cannot avoid this whole discussion of equality.
Another issue that I want to raise among young women is there's this situation where is I would say an imaginary quota. Like, if there's, of course, in any political party, they want to be seen that they want to promote diversity, so they will have one woman within this body of people, but body of council or whatever. But then the same one woman would be representing for every political decision or everything, while the younger women, they would be like kept under her, or just away. So even though it seems like it's promoting diversity, in politics, but at the same time, it's always like constantly the same group of women, representing the voices of women, when the younger ones are being kept silent and all that.
Yes, I don't know if you've heard of this thing called the Smurfette principle.
What's that?
In the cartoons, the Smurfs, right? There's just one female, among them. So it's like this exceptional female, right there, that represents, all of womanhood and all of like women's voices. And you can, it's actually quite, amazing when you actually go out and realize that yes, the Smurfette principles plays out even in politics, even in civil society organizations, for example, coalitions, where you have one woman sitting there as the representative of all the women, regardless,
for years and years.
Yes, regardless of their backgrounds, their differing needs, and all other factors such as disability, like for indigenous women, and the like. I think that on the whole, that political parties are, avoiding facing up to the reality of women moving out of historically support positions and supportive roles within political parties and political movements, and becoming leaders themselves. They mouth and say all the right things, 30% women political participation and all that. But what's the exact machinery that you're going to put into place, and all this? And the same hierarchical structures that actually prevents women from advancing in political parties and in most of public life also play out within the political parties, and unfortunately even within women's wing, itself, where it's not gender that is the factor in terms of the hierarchy. The way that it is in the larger, political party, but it's things like experience, and knowledge and age.
Mm-hmm. You and
I guess that it's really down to the political will, Mm-hmm. If you look at our women's ministry, it's actually not quite a women's ministry, because it takes care of not just issues related to women. It's the disabled, the senior citizens, the disadvantaged, and everybody else. Whereas if you look at the up and coming countries that have just come out from a conflict situation, they actually recognize the empowerment of women. Mm-hmm. So in South Africa, it is actually Minister for the Empowerment of Women. And that makes a difference, because you have a minister that is dedicated to looking at women's issues, because we are not marginalized population. We are half the population, and people tend to forget it. And half the population needs as much laws, policies, resources to actually help it to grow and be part of the whole process of progress. And time and again, I feel that, the federal government, the women's ministry don't seem to see it. They pump a lot of resources. I remember there's a research that has been done like 5-6 years ago on the women's political participation. But that paper, which has so much of data, so much of good recommendations, were never even brought to the cabinet, and neither was it even debated in parliament. So therefore, why do we spend so much money on a research, and then the policy recommendations are hardly even brought to the open for discussion or even for implementation? The same issue as gender budget. A lot of money spent on doing the research on 5 sectors of the ministries, but at the end of it, nothing happens. Year in, year out, we don't even have any mention of how budgets are being allocated in each of the ministry to help women to be to build their capacity and to have more resources. And I think that, when they have this outcry over sexual violence and all that, seriously, I know that, attitudes, needs to change. But the power and the whole machinery is actually in the hands of the women's ministry, in the hands of the federal government. They have to come to terms to tell themselves that, it is time for sex education to be implemented, for them to allocate sufficient resources in social welfare departments, because in each state, the social welfare personnel is so under resource that is unbelievable. So if they don't put in resources, it goes back into that vicious cycle that,
true.
Violence will keep on happening because you don't want to stop it. You only deal with symptoms and you're not dealing with the cause.
So, final question of today: how can we change the current situation and make way for more Malaysian women to be part of politics without having all these different roadblocks?
Oh, that's a huge question.
Yeah, it's a huge one, but synthesize it within a few seconds.
Well, I think that a more general discriminatory attitudes, towards women need to change. That involves, education at a primary level, secondary level, tertiary level, and it really, and politicians themselves also have to take responsibility for what they say. They have to take responsibility for what they say in terms of really perpetuating entrenched, sexism towards women. And they also have to take responsibility for their own roles in promoting greater women's political participation. It is a reality that, in Malaysian politics today, there are a few leaders, who make the decisions, who basically drive, the political parties' engines. And if they can be built, if they take on board, roles as like champions of like women's participation, we can go a long way.
I in addition to that, I think that the political parties will have to start taking this whole issue of women's political participation more seriously. So, which means that including women into their selection team, where they actually decide who actually stands in the party. That has to be changed. The party list that they put out has to change because they have to start thinking of including more women and making sure that, these women that they put out have enough resources and are in places where they can compete fairly. Not putting women against
as a parachute.
giants. Yeah,
Yes.
or parachuting them. Yeah. The other one is really the electoral system. That has to change because that will always disadvantage, particularly women or asli, smaller political parties. Proportional representation, a mix.
Having a more diverse, groups of women rather than just one group of, from a
So,
certain social background as well.
There has been a discussion of a mixed proportional representation that actually can increase women's participation. So the country actually has to take responsibility to move towards that.
I think really political parties, have to stop looking for the exceptional woman, to fill all their women-related needs and look at instead building a base of women, diverse women, young women, older women, a lot of women. And, until and unless they do that, we are still going to be stuck at 10%, women parliamentarians for the next few elections.
Anyway, thank you very much to all.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.